I'm Carla Hayden, Librarian of Congress, and I just want to thank Jamie and Helene and the angels and the readers for allowing me to be with someone who has elevated libraries to such an extent.
Thank you.
Let me just say, there have been patron saints of libraries, Andrew Carnegie, things like that, but you are now number one.
Oh, I finally smacked down Andrew Carnegie.
You have, with that.
That's great.
So how does it feel to be the patron saint now of librarians?
You know, when I started this book, I couldn't have anticipated that part of it. I was drawn into the story because I really wanted to understand what happened in 1986, that this epic fire that closed the LA Library for 7 years. But more importantly, I wanted to understand why I cared about it so much. I've often said, if someone had said to me, you know, City Hall burned down, I would have thought, that's too bad, and I assume they'll rebuild it. But hearing that a library had burned felt like this deep, profoundly personal loss. And I thought, why do we feel such a connection to books? Why do we feel such a connection to libraries, that the idea of one burning is so disturbing? So this combination of both just the investigative curiosity of who started the largest library fire in American history, coupled with this overarching question of why do we care so much about libraries. And I think that acknowledgement of our deep feelings about these places is what stirred a lot of people, because I think for many people it was a reminder to them about how much they care about libraries. And you and I were talking about this earlier. As a writer, the thing that I am most interested in is taking something that seems ordinary and noticing how extraordinary it really is. So libraries are the perhaps perfect example of something that is ordinary in the sense of we all know what libraries are. We've all spent lots of time in libraries. Everybody grew up with a library. But this gave me a chance to say, stop and think for a minute how extraordinary it is that these places exist.
And think about how extraordinary. I got a chance to tour this library. And Aaron, the director, and his staff, and what they do here. An observatory. This is the only library in the country that has an observatory. That has free programming. Telescope. It's like being at the Adler Sanitarium. That's the library.
Yeah,
later.
right.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, right. When libraries had sanitariums,
there
really
are some parts, but a planetarium, and to have that so unique, this library exemplifies everything you were talking about that libraries do, and there was a connection to this library with your book.
This is interesting little side fact, which is the first time I ever came to Rancho Mirage was when I began working on this book, because one of the most important sources for me was Elizabeth Tioman, who, I don't know if she's here in the audience, if she is, but she had been the head of Central Library at the time of the fire. And then she retired to Rancho Mirage, but then her plan to retire was foiled when she was persuaded to run the Rancho Mirage Library. So it is really a kind of poetic moment to be back here talking about the book when, in a sense, I really began the book here.
I made a little reference to a sanitarium. You discovered, and in telling the story of this particular library, you ran into quite a few characters.
I did indeed. And when I began the book, of course, books to me rise and fall on the strength of the human characters. And simply downloading lots and lots of data about libraries would not have made this an interesting book. It really was a book that was populated literally by these characters who come from every different sort of angle of the book. There was Harry Peake, the young man who was accused of having started the fire, who was one very particular kind of character, a very LA character.
That's what
who embodied this whole sort of aspirational mythic quality of LA that draws people who believe that at any moment they will discover celebrity and be elevated to fame and fortune. He moved to LA dreaming of becoming an actor, discovered soon into his attempt to be an actor that he had terrible stage fright. But that didn't stop him in any way. And he really did believe that he was moments away, that the next corner he turned, somebody would discover him and he'd become a star. But then the unexpected characters were, I had gone into the book assuming that I would want to write little capsule descriptions of the people who had run the LA Library in its history. Seemed interesting. I thought, oh, this will be a short paragraph. Little did I know that, actually, let me back up and say, I think the world of people who run libraries is perhaps skewed to the unusual. The world of people who live in LA is perhaps skewed to the unusual. So the Venn diagram of people who run the LA Library is doubly determined to be slightly unusual. And when I dove into the stories of the people who've run the library, starting in the late 1800s, it was as if each one of them could have been a book. They were fascinating. They were eccentric. You had one of the first people to run the library who was a 17-year-old girl at a time when women were not permitted to use the library. She was the head of the library. You had Mary Jones, who was the first trained librarian to run the LA Library and who was, a very, very important figure, and this was turn of the century. She was deposed because she was called in by the library board, and they said, you've done a wonderful job, but wouldn't we all agree it would be better to have the library run by a man? And she said no. And this was at a time when women still didn't have the vote, and she had the wherewithal to say this is absurd and refuse to cede power. Eventually, the city attorney intervened, and although before this happened, thousands of women gathered in Los Angeles and marched in defense of her, and it was known as the Great Library War. And she finally left. The city attorney basically said, you have no protection in your job, and if they want to get rid of you, they can get rid of you. She was replaced by the estimable Charles Lummis. Now, Charles Lummis had been a journalist living in Cincinnati, had been hired by the LA Times. He then packed up and walked to LA from Cincinnati, as one does.
How long did that take?
It was a couple of months. He arrived in LA as a huge celebrity. People met him along the way, cheering him on. So he was a bit of a showboat, you might say. He had no training as a librarian, but he was an intellectual, he was a writer, and he really truly loved the library. He was a bit of an unusual man. He did not believe in censorship, but he felt very strongly that people shouldn't read books that he thought were stupid. But rather than removing those books from the collection, he had a branding iron made with the skull and crossbones, and he branded the books that he thought were particularly stupid and put a bookmark in them saying there are far better books on this topic.
There are temptations to do that.
Oh, I'm sure.
There are. But you can't be judgmental. Just.
And I have to say, if any of you want a wonderful field trip, the library does still have in the rare book collection some of those branded books. So, there was a point where I was writing about Charles Lummis and got so engaged in his story. And by the way, one other thing, which has nothing really to do with the library, but he had a bit of a woman problem, and he had dozens of extramarital affairs. He kept a diary of all of these different assignations.
Well, to keep it
just
straight.
to keep straight who he had told what to.
You have
and
to.
He kept the diary in Spanish, just as a way of kind of keeping it away from his wife. Well, his wife read Spanish. She was fluent in Spanish. So they had one of the most public divorces in LA. I mean, divorce wasn't particularly common at that time, but also this was scandalous. And he had many wives over the course of his life, but he was also a brilliant man, and a lot of what he did, a lot of the innovations he brought to the library, but most importantly, his belief that the library was a democratic institution. Libraries up until that time were really meant to serve educated people, to help them become more educated. And his feeling is, no, libraries are meant to lift everyone. And he promoted the library to factories, to railroad companies, saying, have your workers come to the library. They can better themselves. And this was very radical. It's his spirit that really transformed the LA Library and remains true to this day. I mean, we only have a few of his branded books, but we certainly have this spirit.
Now, on the other hand, you have Harry, who is this aspiring actor. What was he doing in the library? Looking for plays? What was he doing?
It's unclear. I mean, this is really interesting to remember that in 1986, there were no security cameras. There was no record of who came in and out of the library. There's no way of knowing if he really was even in the library. I mean, when you think about crime in the 1980s and how limited we were in being able to figure out even, was he in the library that day? His former I should say, his dear friend said to me, I don't personally remember ever seeing Harry read a book. But there is also the fact that he worked as a messenger. He was downtown a lot. And it's entirely possible that, like many people downtown, the library was a place to stop and sort of collect your thoughts, whether you were there to take a book out or not. I like to think he was reading movie magazines because he was very broke. He wouldn't have been able to buy, or it would have been a stretch for him to spend a lot of money on movie magazines. So he could have been in the library looking up Burt Reynolds' pictures because he believed himself to be a good friend of Burt Reynolds.
And he told a lot of stories. So you have his stories woven into this because he fabricated.
Yes, he was an incredible fabulist. And part of it was harmless. He just made up stories about everything. And what was interesting is realizing, as I was working on this, that libraries are about the essential human need for story. It is the essential unit of human interaction. It's the stories we tell ourselves, it's the stories we share with each other, it's the stories we save and preserve and pass on to the next generation. So having the young man at the center of this crime story be, in his own way, an extravagant storyteller felt like it had a great deal of resonance with the theme of the book, of this idea that our lives are all stories.
So as a journalist, as an author, just how did you get the real library bug, though? I mean, most people would say, oh, like you said, a book about a library.
Right. And, you know, the writing, I became so passionate about the subject. I felt like every aspect of it fascinated me. The science of how, in the fire, 400,000 books were completely destroyed, but 700,000 were damaged and frozen for years to keep them from molding until it could be figured out how to possibly preserve them. So it was just fascinating to read about this effort. It was the largest book recovery effort ever undertaken.
And the largest fire.
Largest fire.
But it didn't get much publicity because of
this incredible kind of coincidence of timing. I went immediately to look at the New York Times from that date because I couldn't understand how I had never heard about this fire. And I pulled up the paper for that day, and the headline says, "Soviets deny meltdown at Chernobyl nuclear plant."
Same day.
The same day, through the accident of fate, this story, which certainly would have gotten more attention, and I was living in New York at the time, so that's why I looked at the New York Times, because I thought, I can't believe the New York Times wouldn't cover this. It's maybe not the A1 headline, but I was sure that it would have gotten attention, and suddenly understood why. The front section of the paper was almost entirely devoted to Chernobyl, and there was a story in the A section toward the back about the fire. But it was just fate that this story, I even know people who lived in LA at the time who have said to me, I don't understand how I never knew about this.
It was the largest fire in LA at the time.
Until very recently, it was the largest structure fire in LA history. And that's saying something because there are a lot of fires in LA, unfortunately. And it remains, and with luck will always remain, the largest library fire in American history, not in the world. Sadly, there have been larger library fires in the world, and certainly in the course of particularly World War II, there were entire libraries where the contents were burned and the building destroyed. So there are precedents, sadly, we've burned libraries since we built libraries.
And why do you think? Some were accidents, but some were intentional.
Many were intentional, and that goes back to my original impulse for doing this book, which is they've been burned because we care about them so deeply. The Nazis had a commandos unit that were called the Bren Commandos. They had one mission, and that was to seek out and burn libraries. It was an effort to send a message to people, which is your history is going to be obliterated. Your culture will not be remembered. You will be wiped off the memory, the Earth's memory. We all think of libraries as one of the safe places, the places that are uniquely sort of removed from the world of strife. You burn down a library, you fill people with terror because you're also saying to them, nowhere is safe. You're not safe. There was an incredibly chilling remark made by a German philosopher, which is where they burn books, next they burn people. And unfortunately, in the history of the world, I would say there's rarely been a regime that burned books that didn't, at some point, begin destroying people. Books are an extension of the human spirit. They are human objects, and they've been treated in this most horrible way as a surrogate for people, for memory, for information, for all of the things that we are, that makes us different from inanimate objects. And it's really, one of the most chilling facts that I learned was one of the world's great book burners was Mao Zedong, and he began his professional life as a librarian.
He knew the power.
Exactly. He knew how powerful books are. And he knew in the effort to reinvent Chinese society that books had to be destroyed and clean the slate.
Alberto Manguel, in his book, The History of Reading, has that chapter on forbidden reading.
Oh, really?
And he says, as slave owners, dictators, and other illicit holders of power have known, the easiest group of people to rule is the illiterate. And if you cannot prevent people from learning to read, you destroy the books.
And it's interesting because libraries are so, in the present day, more than ever, really make literacy a huge part of their mission because, and again, this is an interesting evolution from libraries having been basically gentlemen's clubs for educated men. Then it evolved. By the way, I find it so funny that I was astonished to learn that for many, many, many years, children were not allowed in libraries. Then children 15 years old and older could come. Then children 12 years old who had a certain grade point average. Then, and now we think of libraries as working with children being so essential to what they do, but they weren't permitted in the library.
Now we have Mother Goose on the loose.
Right.
With babies and people reading to
Yeah,
babies.
they have stroller jams at
This
the
library
LA
has
library.
it. They were telling me about their children's room, and that there are times when you have a traffic jam of strollers.
Yeah, I love it. And it does seem so funny to look back in the history of this institution and realize that there was a point where the idea that children would be in there was just... But we've embraced literacy. It's a natural extension of what a library is in the very best sense. And there is such a lot of outreach on that. And it's not just, it's literacy for adults as well as for children.
Now, you were surprised at some of the activities that libraries are doing. This library does so many things, different types of programming and things like that. And you were finding that when you looked at what was going on in LA and other libraries, yoga classes.
And you know, one of my favorite things was when there was this oil spill in Rancho, which is, I believe it's Ventura County, and people were evacuated for a very long time. And the library became the community center. And the librarians knew how stressful it was for people to be evacuated and have nowhere, you know, they didn't know when they would get back into their homes. So the library started offering yoga classes and meditation classes to help the general mood of the community. I loved it because, you know, nobody, I mean, this is probably a radical thing to say, but people don't have warm, fuzzy feelings about government. And they don't think, you know, wow, I love going to the DMV. But
they're doing better.
yeah, I don't think
I
in
went
California.
recently. It was nice.
But we feel this tremendous sense of, I think people do feel that libraries are coming from an incredibly, not only a positive place, but an efficient place, that they figure out what people need and provide it, and there isn't a bunch of lines and red tape and bureaucracy. They see a need and they move quite quickly to fill that need.
You mentioned the stagecraft of preparing for the library doors to open. It was like being at a theater, you said.
I spent a lot of mornings going down to the library early before it opened. And, you know, one of the things I wanted to do was both investigate the story of this fire, look at the whole history of libraries and the LA library, explore my own relationship to them, but then also conjure as much as I could the feeling of what is it like day to day in the library. So I spent time in every department of the library, and of course realizing that librarians don't come at 10 a.m. when the library opens, but they come earlier and get things ready. And in the meantime, there are all sorts of people waiting and very antsy to get in at 10 a.m. And it's a ritual. Everybody's sort of milling around, and the security guard keeps saying, it's not 10 yet, not 10 yet. And it was a wonderful feeling of this preparation, all of this buzzing activity, preparation for the day to begin, and then the doors opened and people flooded in, and the library began its daily life. And it was a wonderful thing to observe, and it was so much fun for me to spend time in each department of the library, and I don't mean just the subject departments, the English department, science, but things I didn't even know existed, like the shipping department and the reference
Telephone reference.
Telephone
this
reference.
library, I met the telephone reference librarians here and was asking them, well, what are the questions? What are people at? You mean they're calling you up? And it's like, oh, yes.
And it's incredible. I mean, I had no idea, because you think, well, Google certainly has made it not necessary to call the library. The fact is, people call the library all day long.
Time. All the time.
And, you know, they ask questions that some of the librarians are puzzled by. They ask a lot of questions that could be Googled very easily, but
they want a human being to interact with. And part of the librarian's creed, as you know, is that we only ask you questions to satisfy your need, even though we would love to know why you want the spatula and the timer and the other thing all at once.
Right.
We really do want to know, but we can't ask you why.
Well, and that very deliberate, unjudgmental attitude is something pretty wonderful. I mean, I sat in the reference room, and it was really funny. I've got to admit, if you want a fun field trip, I recommend sitting in the reference room for a while, because you think, why at 10:07 on a Tuesday morning is somebody wondering what movies Dana Delaney has been in since 1995? You think, wow, someone was wondering that right now.
And wanted to get an answer from you.
Right. And, you know, and the librarians are amazed much of the time. Or my favorite one was somebody calling and asking the reference librarian if a certain can of beans in her pantry was safe to eat. And the librarian actually knew a website where you can Google the identifying marks on the can to find out when the food was produced, and then had another website she could go to that said when foods become dangerous to eat. And at the same time, she was worried that she might have some legal liability if she said to the woman,
It's
they're
okay.
fine, and the woman ate them and got sick. So it was really funny. It's also, I mean, I think we have reached peak lack of human contact. And I see society moving back toward human interaction. And that is one of the ways that libraries offer a different experience than sitting at home alone and Googling. And I'm not saying if you want to, what's the capital of Tennessee, that you should call the library. But more generally, I think that the way, I feel that we've all been saturated with online inanimate experiences, and that the place we're heading toward as a culture is one in which human interaction is really prized and valued and sought after.
Erin mentioned that at this library they had a self-checkout, and they took it out because people didn't want to just do self-checkout. They wanted
Really?
interaction.
That's interesting.
You mentioned that the experience was similar to what you had when you investigated and looked into a supermarket.
You know, this may not seem like an important interaction, but there is a moment when you're checking out a book and you make eye contact with the librarian and exchange pleasantries. I can absolutely understand how people would miss that. It's part of what they want when they're in a library is some human interaction. And I absolutely can, this is what I think of as ambient social interaction. It's the librarian may not become your best friend, but in the course of a day, it's rather nice to have someone say, oh, this is a terrific book. I just read it. Check it out, done. As opposed to going and scanning and walking out of the library with the book. It's a place where the automation doesn't feel necessary. In a supermarket, when there's a long line of 100 people with 7,000 groceries,
Yeah, you don't want that.
then you
chit
want
chat.
the automatic. And I secretly always fantasize about being a cashier, so there's part of me that loves the self-checkout at the grocery store, even though it always takes me longer. But libraries are human. That is what makes them special. Of course, it's the books, but it's the human aspect of it that has meant that they have not just endured, but thrived.
Now, there was tension in terms of libraries being open for all, and that means all people who are homeless, people who, as you call them, lost souls, being in there.
You know, when you consider the places where we interact in a completely uncurated way, just wide open to anyone and everything, there aren't that many places. Public parks, the library, I guess the public streets. And so there is always going to be an element of tension over bringing together the greatest extremes of society. It's also the fact that, I mean, that is the nature of libraries, is to be open to all. When you have an issue of homelessness in our society that isn't being well addressed, the places that have the flexibility to include the homeless are going to be overextended. It's not the library's problem, it's society's problem to not be providing more places that can absorb people who need a place to go and don't have anywhere to go.
And lost souls who might not be homeless, but
they're lonely, they have a lot of time on their hands, and a library is a warm, embracing environment. And thank goodness that they exist, because we all have the potential to feel lost at times, or simply just need somewhere to be and not be alone.
now I want to switch a little bit back to the impact of the fire, the hundreds of thousands of books that were destroyed. To give a sense for the people that are sitting in this room, Erin, the director, told me that this room was filled with book stacks. And on Monday morning, those book stacks will be back.
Amazing.
60,000 books, right where everybody's sitting, were removed. Now, how many volumes again were destroyed?
400.
So think about that.
400,000 were completely destroyed. 700,000 were damaged. And just as a footnote to that, of the 700,000 that were damaged, the majority of those were salvaged, which is amazing. Another fact, I was going to say another fun fact, but it's not a fun fact. The city of Los Angeles had insurance on the building, but not on the books. The building did suffer some damage, but the primary loss was the books. So all of the money needed to replace those 400,000 books and to repair and hopefully salvage the 700,000 books, this was more than half of all of the books in the collection. That all had to be raised from the public, $22 million.
And
Not a penny of insurance. I am not sure if, because I've asked insurance people who have said, well, a building is durable. Books, you know, I didn't even know this. A complete new piece of information to me is that a library buys a book, and if it's a popular book and gets checked out a lot, it has to be replaced quickly because books eventually fall apart or they get soiled. And so if you have a book like the Da Vinci Code that gets checked out all the time, the one you're checking out is probably the 100th one that the library has owned. It's not that they buy one book and have it permanently, unless it's a book that no one ever checks out. But my guess is that insurance companies would be very uncomfortable insuring something that was really such a fungible commodity. But that's the wealth of a library, are the books.
And you mentioned some are soiled. I have to just share this there. One library did a display on the things that are returned when books are returned.
Ah,
One had people use very interesting things for bookmarks, a piece of bacon, photographs. So there's an entire department when you're checking books back in that return things to people. Now, I have to ask you something, speaking of the fire and the burning of the books and everything. You have it in the book, so this is public information. You burned a book. You became an expert in the physics of fire, and I become one reading fire and what types of fire and all this, but you actually burned a book.
let me tell you the story.
You have an excuse.
I have an excuse.
It was research.
It was research.
Okay.
And I thought, I'm describing the sight of 400,000 books burning. I've never seen a book burn. It would be useful for me to know what that looks like. But secondly, and probably more importantly, I thought I logically know that if I burn a book, I can go and replace it easily. Just go to the bookstore, buy another copy. I am not removing from human civilization this document. So theoretically, I shouldn't find this discomforting. I could not bear the thought of doing it. And I thought, this is almost superstitious. So I thought, all right, I'm going to pick a book to burn. Come on, I can do this. So I thought, well, I'll burn a book I don't like. And then I thought, that seems really wrong. So I thought, well, I'll burn a book I really like. And I thought, I'm not going to burn a book I really like. I thought, well, I'll burn one of my books because I have lots of copies of my books.
You mean the book that you wrote?
No, like The Orchid Thief. I thought, well, I'll
books.
burn an Orchid Thief. I've got, 100 Orchid Thieves. And then I thought, well, I'm not going to burn one of my books. And I finally thought, I can't do this. I mean, I know it's silly. I know it's superstitious. I know it doesn't mean what it means when the Nazis had book burning celebrations. And I know I'm doing this for research, but I cannot bring myself to burn a book. And I thought, I'm just not going to do it. One day, my husband came home, and he was just grinning ear to ear, and he said, I found the book for you to burn. And he handed me a copy of Fahrenheit 451. And I thought, well, bingo, there's my book. And I thought, Ray Bradbury, of all people, would approve of this, since he was, of course, writing about a society in which books were banned, and if they were found, they were burned. He also, coincidentally, didn't have the money to go to college, and for his education, spent over the course of 14 years, by his telling, went to the LA Library, the downtown branch, every day, reading his way through the library. He was passionate about the library. He loved the LA Library. He wrote Fahrenheit 451 in the library. And the corner of Flower and Hope Street in downtown LA is now called the Ray Bradbury Corner. He became very instrumental in raising that money to repair those destroyed books. He really, truly was, if there was a patron saint of libraries, it certainly was him. And I know when I burned that book that he approved.
Well, Susan, I have to say, and end by saying, on behalf of hundreds of thousands of people who work in libraries every day and all over the world, we thank you for elevating libraries, because it took someone with your talent to bring libraries alive in a way that we talk about them, we're librarians, but you just put the grace and the beauty.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.